So, everyone, welcome back. In case you didn't know who we are, we're the Dank History Show. We talk about history. I'm Bradley Cooper.
And I'm Katie Cooper.
And we are your two hosts of this show. And as you might be aware of, next week is the holiday, known colloquially as Turkey Day.
United States Thanksgiving.
United States Thanksgiving. It's that time when you sit down awkwardly with all your family members as old Uncle Joe talks about politics. They all complain, and then everyone just eats so much food they fall into a food coma until they arise from their slumber to go shopping on Black Friday.
I love that they complain about each other. That's very true.
That's true. Because Thanksgiving is the time of year when you have to hang out. Well, you don't have to hang out, but you end up hanging out with some of the people that are like, you haven't seen in a while, and then you remember why you haven't seen them in a while. Just kidding, everyone. I do actually really like Thanksgiving.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, because it's sort of the beginning of a whole holiday season, if you will. And it's sort of a nice segue in between Halloween and Thanksgiving.
Yes.
So, today what we're going to do is, because it's next week, exactly 1 week, we're going to be talking about the history behind this holiday, as well as debunk some myths about it. Like, the most obvious story is some folks that wore fancy hats had a meal once with some guys.
Some fancy hats.
Well, I mean, do you remember all those, Thanksgiving plays people would have with, the buckles?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And the
Everybody
little
does
headdresses. That. So, we're going to talk about the history of it, debunk some of the myths. But in order to do that, we're going to have to discuss the Puritans, obviously. But because of a little thing called context, which I love. I don't know how many of you love context, but I just love to get at the context, What's really it all about?
Context is good.
Yes.
I mean, why do we do what we do?
Yes, and that's a good tip for personal relationships. Get to the context of the problems. Know what I mean?
Sure. Oh my goodness.
So, but we're not going to just be talking about those fancy people with their fancy hats and their fancy buckles. We're also going to talk about the origin of them. So we're going to talk...
The origin of the fancy buckles.
Yes. We're going to talk about the origin of the fancy buckles. Like, where did those buckles come from? How did they get them?
What is the attraction?
What is the attraction? Okay. Just a quick aside. If you didn't get that reference, that is from the Comprehensive History of Christianity,
which we will never, ever, ever go into.
But here's the thing.
No, we will not.
We will not go into it. But the amount of stuff that's written down about the history of this man's life is more than George Washington, and it is very dank. And I would highly encourage our listeners to go look up that series, A Comprehensive History of Christianity.
I wouldn't, because it is so long, and a lot of it is so
bad.
Complex.
Yes, it's very complex.
It's a complex subject.
It's a very complex subject. My name is Christian Weston Chandler.
Stop it.
So, we're going to talk about, the Pilgrims, but we're also going to talk about the English Reformation, which was how all this stuff got started. We're also going to talk about the Native American tribes living there because, there were other people who lived in America at the time.
Shocking.
And we're also just going to talk about, Thanksgiving as a holiday. Like, how did Thanksgiving become an official holiday, and what's its legacy? Like, same thing we did with, Halloween last month. So, in order to understand the Puritans, we have to go way back. We have to look at the beginnings of the English Reformation. But to understand the English Reformation, we have to go back to how the Tudors begun. And the Tudors, if you didn't know, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, that dynasty.
Not Tuto. We're not cheating children.
No, but have you ever seen those
UTOR.
those little paper signs people put up that pick a tutor, and it's just the tutors.
Yes.
Have a tutor help you with your assignments.
I would love to have a tutor, not tutor help me.
Yeah. I mean, probably Elizabeth I'd want to have help me, and Henry VII, not Henry VIII. He just sounds like he was kind of a dunce. But
no comment.
He was a redhead, much like me.
Again, no comment.
No comment. So, for some context, England, around the 1400s, they had a little war called the War of the Roses. There was a movie called The War of the Roses. It was not about this event. The War of the Roses was a big war.
What was it about? I've never heard of that movie.
I think it was about a very angry divorce where they tried to kill each other.
Huh. That's
Which
weird.
I guess is kind of relevant because the War of the Roses was basically like a huge conflict between a whole bunch of cousins over who should rule.
So basically Game of Thrones.
Yeah, well, Game of Thrones is based off a lot of stuff from the War of the Roses. Like, I think I talked about one of them once. What was her name? It was like this French princess that Cersei was based off of.
We'll have to go back. I don't remember.
And she had the son that was much like Joffrey that had a whole bunch of people beheaded.
Again, I'll have to go back at my notes. We've done a lot since then.
Yeah, we
I
have.
don't know what episode we're on.
I think, well, this season we're on episode 11, I think.
Yeah, we did it last season or last.
Well, this
semester.
season, yeah. I haven't posted the ones from the summer online, not a whole lot of them, but I've posted all of them that we've had so far. Good for
Okay.
last week's. So, anyway, War of the Roses. It was a long fight, lasted for about 30 or so years, but at 1485, the war finally came to an end after a guy named Richard III, and you might know of that from the William Shakespeare play, a little short guy with a little bit of a hunchback. He was killed at the Battle of Bosworth, and a little guy named Henry VII took control. Now, this was a major event for two main reasons. The first was this was the last time an English royal would actually die in battle. That hasn't happened since the 1400s. So lucky for the English. Though a few of them would get beheaded later. So Elizabeth I's family tree is very complicated. It sometimes looks like a circle if you look at it closely enough.
I don't even want to think about that. Keep going.
Yep. So, and the second reason was this brought an end to the Plantagenet rule in England. And the Plantagenets were basically a dynasty that included people like Richard Lionheart. Big dynasty. A lot of weird people. A lot of interesting people. A lot of crazy people. But brought into their dynasty, and it brought forth the Tudors. Now, the Tudors were interesting because they contained such people as, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and they're sort of almost like the English Renaissance rulers. The Renaissance. Yep. So what Henry VII did, and not to be confused with his son, Henry VIII, he actually had a son who was older than Henry VIII named Arthur, and he had his son betrothed to Catherine of Aragon.
Aragorn.
Yeah, not Aragorn. This was not Lord of the Rings, unfortunately.
Ugh.
Aragon was basically northeastern Spain, basically. And it would later become officially Spain, but right now Spain was a whole bunch of different countries. So, Arthur officially married her in 1501, but then he dropped dead in 1502 suddenly. So, England would never get a King Arthur, unfortunately.
Boo.
I mean, there was probably a guy named King Arthur way, way back in the 500s, but he certainly wasn't related to any of these people. But Henry VII wanted to get his younger son to still, marry Catherine of Aragon, his younger son named Henry. However, the Catholic Church at the time actually forbade marrying your brother's widow because it was considered, kind of like incest.
Ugh.
But, Henry VII was able to pull some strings and, work some stuff out. And by 1509, Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon, and then Henry VIII became king. Now, at the same time all this stuff was happening, in the mid-1500s, we had a German guy, went by the name of Martin Luther. You might have heard of him. He had 99 problems, but the Catholic Church was one of them.
But the Catholic Church was one.
And
He had his 95 Reese's Pieces.
yeah, was it 95 or 99? I think it was
honestly don't
95.
remember. It's one of those. It has to be one of those.
Yeah.
Martin Luther.
How many theses were there?
How many Reese's were there?
How many Reese's? One Reese's, two Reese's. I just want to write all of the
95.
95.
I was right.
Yeah.
Ha-ha.
95 theses. I just want to write each of the individual theses on a Reese's Pieces now, a Reese's cup now, and
Yes.
just nail them to a wall of somewhere. Wouldn't that be cool?
That would be really funny.
Yeah. So this guy was around, And with
This
help,
guy was around, yes.
and he had some ideas about how things should change, and he didn't like a lot of the Catholic teachings. We won't go into all the details, but basically, he helped jumpstart the Protestant Reformation. And because the printing press had just been invented, his writings were able to spread basically across Europe, whereas in previous times, that writing probably wouldn't reach very far.
Would they have like a caller of some sort that out in the streets yelling, "This is what's going on"?
Yeah, they would have a caller, and obviously he might write a few copies here and there. People would copy it down, and it might spread orally.
Right.
But the fact that it was in the printing press form allowed it to spread really, really quickly, because you could print them out by thousands and just ship them off and translate them. And this was helped out by people in England who also weren't big fans of the Catholic Church. People like Erasmus, who lived in Cambridge, and also people like Thomas More, who was one of the king's advisors. So the Protestant Reformation was having its impact in England, but Henry VIII himself actually wasn't really too interested in the Reformation, oddly enough. In fact, when Martin Luther wrote a book talking about how he didn't like all the sacraments in the Catholic Church, and that would include stuff like the baptism, Eucharist, marriage, all that stuff, Henry VIII actually wrote a response to this pamphlet by Martin Luther, and for it he was actually named Defender of the Faith in the Catholic Church, which it was a title given basically to people who were considered, great defenders of the Catholic faith.
Neat.
But what's funny about this is we don't remember Henry VIII for this. We remember him for another reason.
Was he the Anglican Church guy?
Yes, the guy who founded the Anglican
why.
Church. Now, let's explain why that happened. So, by 1527, Catherine hadn't had any sons. She had had one daughter, Mary, who was later known as Bloody Mary.
I'm just now getting that connection.
Yeah, the Bloody Mary drink.
Sense.
And
well, no, not even that. I didn't realize that was his daughter.
Yeah, that was his daughter.
For some reason, I never made it. I don't know.
Yeah, because after he died, he had a son, Edward VI, I think, who took over very briefly. Then he died. Then Mary came back and tried to make England Catholic.
Gotcha.
And then, Elizabeth I came along. But Catherine hadn't had any sons, and Henry VIII, being a combination of both very religious and also deeply narcissistic, believed that this was a result of God punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. That was at least how he justified in his mind. So he sought an annulment so he could shack up with a woman named Anne Boleyn, who was, basically one of his favorites at the time. Now, a quick note, a lot of people say he wanted to divorce his wife. An annulment is actually a little bit different than divorce. An annulment is saying the marriage was never valid to begin with for extenuating circumstances, like...
Like what?
Well, something like... It could be something like, to get a little edgy, like, they never had sex, or, there was not a whole lot of... Or, like, she was married before to someone, and that he didn't know about it, or that... In his case, it would have been kind of questionable because she was initially married to his brother. So basically what annulment is saying is that the marriage was never valid to begin with, under Catholic law.
Right.
So, and now under normal circumstances, the Pope would actually probably have allowed this. A lot of popes would allow, kings to do this all the time. But there was a situation going on in Rome at the time. And that was, there was a guy named Charles V. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, which is a really confusing title, but basically meant at the time that he ruled basically most of Germany and a little bit of Spain. And he happened to be the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. And he had just gotten into a war with the Pope and had actually conquered Rome. And when the Pope got this letter from Henry VIII, Charles V basically said, well, I mean, you can grant that annulment, but, popes are known to have accidents, especially as they're walking along the bridge. They go for a swim, and you never know what could happen.
Oh, that's not a threat at all.
No, not a threat at all.
Never.
So, because he didn't want to see his aunt, humiliated like that, the Pope was like, no, I can't do it. So... Henry VIII tried to get this annulment passed, but when it wasn't working, he got angry, he got frustrated, and then he got Anne Boleyn pregnant. So he decided, all right, we need to do this marriage quickly, and the only way we can do it is to basically make me the head of the church. And there were other people around who were sort of encouraging him to do that. People like Thomas More, who was one of his big advisors. So Thomas More had him marry Anne Boleyn, and then they passed the Act of Restraint and Appeals to Rome. And this meant that the clergy had to officially answer to the king, not the pope.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. We both have been a little sicky. Not too terribly sicky, but...
No, it's that time of year where the plague... It's not terrible yet, but it will probably be later.
It will be later. So, this officially created the Church of England. Now, the Church of England is a really weird organization back then, because even though Henry VIII did this, he was still mostly pretty Catholic, and he definitely kept up a lot of the Catholic ideas and teachings, but he did use this as an excuse to like seize a sort of official Catholic Church lands to empower himself. But at the same time, people in England who want to be more Protestant and, bring about more reform, like, reading the Bible in public, he would crush them as well.
Well, that's upsetting.
So the Church of England was just this really weird compromise at the time between Protestants who wanted more reform and, Catholics who sort of, kind of acquiesced to the Anglicanism. Now, all this issues eventually lead to a group we know as the Puritans. The Puritans. Now, naturally, many people weren't very happy with the Church of England, especially as it got more established. Like when Elizabeth I took over, and she was, for those that didn't know, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn had gotten her head cut off, unfortunately. So, if you need to remember Henry VIII's wives, it's a divorce, beheaded, died. Divorce, beheaded, survived.
It's a pattern.
Yeah, 6 of them.
Kind of. That's so sad.
It is sad.
When anything happens 6 times, it's a pattern.
Yeah, he was a little bit of an oddball, to put it mildly. And he's a lot of times, even though he's remembered kind of fondly in America and England, he's sort of looked upon as a tyrant, which makes sense because he executed a whole lot of people. It was kind of nuts. But his daughter Elizabeth I eventually took over, and she wanted to really establish the Church of England. She was a strong Protestant, wanted to get it set up. But a lot of the Puritans didn't like that. Now, before we get into really what the Puritans are, we have to deal with a few misconceptions about them. Because, okay, what do you think of when you envision Puritans, Katie?
Well, I know what the Puritans are because I did read more into it, but the traditional sense is the buckles, the hats, the black clothes, the white collars, the bonnets, the aprons.
Right.
The weird shoes.
Yeah, and also kind of like a general sense of being puritanical, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So the issue is some of this is a bit of an exaggeration. Like, some of our ideas of what Puritans are come actually from fictional books, like The Scarlet Letter. I don't know. Have you ever read that one?
Letter. No. No, actually.
I actually haven't read it. I've just read the manga version of it, which was pretty good.
From what I understand, it's really sad.
It is sad. But the first big misconception is that they never wore buckles on their hats, as far as we know.
They thought it was too flashy.
Yeah, way too flashy. And also, Puritans, even though they did have a general, more like austere view of things, they actually came from there were a large variety of Puritans. There were some who were very hardline, there were some that were very moderate, so the puritanical stuff sort of varies. Now, what they were united on was their desire to purify the Church of England. And there were a lot of things they didn't like about the Church of England. Some of them they didn't like, it was more the appearance. They didn't like, all the crucifixes or the vestments, the special outfits. They thought they would look like too Catholic. And they also didn't like that they were basically forced to do, when they went to church, many things that were Catholic. Because the general idea at the time by many Protestants was, well, let's not get rid of everything that's Catholic. Let's just get rid of the problematic stuff and let's keep all the fancy stuff. And, if you disagree with that, that's fine, but just do it anyway. Who cares? Well, they certainly cared. And A quick note about Puritans is that we need to keep them separate from a group called the Separatists. And no, not the Separatists from Star Wars.
Oh, yeah. I forgot they were called separatists.
Yeah, they were Separatists. The trade union, the banking clan.
You're so nerdy.
This is getting out of hand. Now there are two of them.
I forgot about that. Oh, episode 1 was so weird. It was all about trade.
Actually, the Separatists didn't originate until episode 2. Episode 1, though, did have the trade union.
That's true. Okay.
Yeah, because they were doing a trade blockade against Naboo.
I'm trying to remember who the Separatists were.
The Separatists were, like, mostly the trade union, but they were other groups. Like, you remember that weird guy with the little, like, dubstep sign? The banking clan. And the little insect people.
Those meetings, I didn't pay attention.
Yeah. And there's the Clone War cartoon explains a whole lot more.
I've never seen the Clone War cartoon.
You should watch it. It's really good. Anakin is actually a much more interesting character in it than in the movies.
Does he still hate sand?
Oh, yeah. He definitely hates sand.
It's understandable why he hates sand because of he was a slave and his whole planet was sandy, but come on.
I don't like sand very much. It's coarse and rough and irritating. It's everywhere. Not like you, where it's soft and smooth.
You're so goofy.
So, where was I? Oh, yeah, Separatists. So, the Separatists were Puritans, who took the next step. They thought, we're not just going to purify the church, we're going to leave the Church of England and start our own thing. And make our own denomination. And you see this, throughout history. You'll see groups of people who just want to reform, groups or political parties from within. And then you'll see people who want to leave and do their own thing. Now, many Puritans also adopted more puritanical ideas. And that would be stuff like, not having sex on Sunday or like... not liking the plays of Shakespeare and acting. And funny enough, there is a line in a Shakespearean play where he makes fun of a Puritan. Where he's talking about someone as kind of a know-it-all that always has something to say and thinks highly of themselves. And then there's a line where someone said, "Do you think this man is a Puritan?" And he said, "A Puritan, if he was, I'd beat him like a dog."
Oh, no.
So he
was aware of what was going on. Of course he would if they're... boycotting his plays. He's gonna be like, oh my goodness.
Yeah. So the way I describe them is it's kind of like I'm trying to think of a really good analogy. It's like, okay, think like Ned Flanders in the early 2000s. Like people...
I'm tracking, but I don't know if everyone else will.
It's okay. Ned Flanders is a Simpsons character. Kind of like he's a pretty conservative evangelical Christian.
Right.
So someone in the mid-2000s where it's like people kind of think he's always like saying something about, the culture and all these evils and stuff. And people just kind of view him as kind of being annoying. Like they didn't view the Puritans necessarily as horrible. They were like, they're kind of annoying. Mm-hmm. Like, can they
it's that guy.
Yeah, it's that guy again. And what's interesting is that the kings and queens of England actually kind of had the same perspective. Elizabeth I and James I, who was her nephew, basically, nephew? I think it was. I'll look it up later. Anyway, they basically had the mindset when it came to Puritans, calm down, guys. I mean, just calm down. Like, James I even threw them a bone by commissioning the writing of probably the most famous Bible ever known, the King James Bible. With all those thees and thous and thines and unicorns.
Oh, unicorn.
Yeah. Unicorns are in the King James Bible because of a mistranslation.
Oh, what is that supposed to be?
I think it's probably just a horse or something, or like a rhinoceros or something. I'll need to look it up, but it's a mistranslation. So, what's important to note here is that one big thing you hear a lot about, when the Puritans fled to America is they were fleeing religious persecution, right?
Yes.
That's actually not really all that true. I mean...
Really?
No. James I was not slaughtering or horribly persecuting these Puritans. The only thing that happened is that they passed something that said, okay, if you're not going to teach and believe all the stuff Church of England does, you can't be a pastor or a bishop within the Church of England. That's pretty much it.
Well, I did that all wrong. I was trying to explain it to my 3-year-olds. Yeah, I did that. Said that wrong.
Oh, that was religious persecution?
It was basically I said they wanted to worship God the way they wanted. Well, that's not wrong.
It's not wrong, no.
No, that's still about right.
It
That's
is
all
a-
I said was they wanted to worship God the way they wanted to worship.
That is definitely right. They wanted to do things their own way, and England wasn't necessarily saying them not to do that. They would, they discouraged that, but it wasn't like,
It wasn't like they were going to get in trouble.
yeah,
for
it wasn't like anyone was getting burned at the stake or anything
Weren't
like
people
that.
getting arrested though?
There were one or two people that got arrested, mostly, from what I understand, mostly for kind of like causing a scene or something like that.
Okay.
But overall, there wasn't really a whole lot of persecution, is what I'm trying to say. Now, this does change. Now, even under James the First, though, there is a push for people to begin to leave behind the Church of England because the Puritans start to see, all right, it's not going to change, we got to leave. And some actually become separatists, and these are the first people who do go to Plymouth, by the way, which we'll talk about in a minute. But James I never wanted to force these people to come back. He's like, all right, get out of here, who cares? Now, this does change when a little guy named Charles I comes to the throne, who's the guy right after James. Now, Charles I believed very strongly in his own authority and that he had a divine right to rule. He was not moderate like his father, and he believed he shouldn't have to answer to anyone, while the Puritans began to really challenge his authority. And by this point, by the time of Charles I, actually most of Parliament was, if not Puritan, influenced by Puritanism. And Charles I also tries to bring about more anti-Puritan theology. Okay, just for context here, Charles I is after, like, the Pilgrims go to Plymouth and everything. I'm just talking about the context.
Gotcha.
So, Charles starts to really adopt a lot of Arminian theology. You don't have to understand anything about Arminianism other than they believe free will is a thing. And he did this to attack the Puritans, who were mainly Calvinistic, which basically means, free will is false, God predestines some to be saved, others to be lost. Yeah. From here, there's a lot of conflict between Puritans and the Royals for a battle for the soul of the Church of England. And eventually it leads to a civil war between Charles I and Parliament, famously known as the Cavaliers and the Roundheads, because, Charles I's Cavaliers versus the Puritans who sort of had their hair like a bowl cut, basically. Roundheads. And the Roundheads won, and Parliament took over. England became a republic for a while. We got a little guy named Oliver Cromwell, which, ask your Irish relatives how they feel about Oliver Cromwell, if you ever get a chance. He was kind of a bit of a jerk. Now, but eventually, this Puritan takeover is overturned, and a guy named Charles II comes to power. And because he didn't like that his dad, Charles I, got beheaded, he decided to pass the Great Ejection. And he basically says, all right, any of you Puritans who are involved in church leadership at all, I'm going to kick you out. You are gone. You're done. And this led to a major split, where some Puritans adopted a more moderate perspective. They rolled back all their teachings, while others became very hardcore separatists. And these separatists began to flee in droves, and they became all sorts of different groups. Some of them include intensified Puritans, but there were also other groups that emerged as well. And these people like the Quakers, the Sabbatarians, and the Muggles.
Are you sure? I was trying to look that up. Well, I looked ahead and I'm like, are you sure that's a thing?
Muggletarians.
Muggletarian. Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
Because when I tried looking up Muggle, all it came up was with Harry Potter.
Yeah, look up Muggletarian religion.
That's a thing?
Yeah, it was a thing.
That's amazing.
I couldn't believe it when I heard that. So,
Muggletonian?
Muggletonian, that's it.
Muggletonian. That is a thing.
Yeah, so I really wonder if J.K. Rowling got the name from that.
Oh, that's funny.
What
were they actually called? Were they called Muggletonians?
Yes, Muggles was a commonly referred to word.
Serious?
Yeah, the Muggles.
That's fantastic.
And it actually does kind of fit because the Muggles believe that God didn't really interact in daily life. So, know a whole lot of miracles or stuff like that. And they only thought that the end times was when big stuff would happen. And their services, interestingly enough, didn't feature any preaching. They were just getting together, chatting, and socializing. And they really didn't like any form of evangelism.
Now
So,
I'm on Reddit trying to figure out.
so going out, preaching and stuff. They were egalitarian and largely pacifistic, and in some ways, they're similar to the Harry Potter Muggles because they weren't really big on like shaking the boat. No magic, no stuff like that. Just sort of be a Muggle.
So basically, yeah, a Muggle in Harry Potter world.
Yeah. So the Muggles are real.
That's amazing. I mean, I'm not trying to sidetrack, but that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I like to think of it as like, the breakdown of the Harry Potter houses. Like, you got the Quakers, they're the Hufflepuffs, obviously. You got the Muggles, and they got the Sabbatarians. I guess they'd be, I don't know, Slytherin or something.
If they're trying to sabotage, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Sabbatarian means like Sabbath keeping.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
for some reason, I thought it meant sabotage, and I was
Yeah.
so caught up with Muggle. I'm like, they're mean.
No. Yeah,
Sabbath
not
keepers would be.
like the Seventh-day Baptists and people like that.
Well, I'm trying to think what house they would fall under. The rule followers. I guess they'd be Ravenclaw.
Yeah, I was thinking Ravenclaw because especially they're about like reading back into the Old Testament
Right,
stuff and
right.
finding the ancient text.
So we've got we've got Muggles.
And the intensive Puritans, I'm guess, would be like Gryffindor. They double down.
Yeah, I would think so. Or well, okay, Gryffindor. They're brave and they want justice. So yeah, probably.
Yeah, and then the people that sort of stick around become more moderate. They'd be Slytherin, I guess.
Slytherin though has
sort-
I would say almost an agenda. They're achievers.
Right. And there were other groups that came out of this as well, besides just the Quakers. Like, this is also where we get groups that are almost like, socialistic. We get groups that believed in free love that sort of came out of this. So there was a lot of experimentation going on with English religion in the 1600s. Now, we've talked about Puritanism, but let's move on to Puritans in America.
The United States.
USA.
Yes.
America, interestingly enough, is named after an Italian guy, Vespucci Amerigo.
Huzzah.
Yep. So yeah, okay. Now, we all know that the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth Rock in, 1620, whatever. But not many of us know what the situation was like in that area of North America at the time. So, 1600, there were obviously people who lived there, and these were a group of Native American tribes, and I'm going to butcher all of the pronunciations on these, so please forgive me.
And
But
that's how we do it here on Dank History.
yes. There was a group of people who spoke a language known as Algonquian, and there were about 100,000 of those people living in the area around Massachusetts. These include people like the Nauset, the Wampanoag, the Massachusetts, Narragansett, and others. And they called themselves the Nini-Missiniuak, people of the first light. And they called their lands, Massachusetts, the Dawn Land, so the land of light. And their leaders were known as sachems, which we might call them like chiefs or something like that. And they had been actually interacting with European traders since the 1500s, because even though a lot of areas hadn't been settled yet, there were still like European traders and, people who would, go on the seas, who would like travel up and down the coast. However, relations between these tribes and the Europeans really began to sour when the Europeans began kidnapping a lot of the locals to try to sell as slaves. And also, the high population of the natives was able to prevent any Europeans from settling there along, the Massachusetts Bay initially. However, in 1616, which is 4 years before Plymouth, diseases from the Europeans began to spread to the Algonquian people, which led to people dying in droves on the coast due to lack of immunity due to these illnesses. And this is called
You do.
Yep. This is called by their people as the Great Dying from 1616 to 1619.
That will happen. If you're not immune to crazy diseases,
Yes.
it will happen.
That will happen. And there was this guy named Massasoit, and he was a sachem of the Wampanoag people, and a lot of his people had died, a huge amount. And he really was worried that his rivals, the Narragansett to the west, were going to swallow up his group. So he was looking for a way to try to prevent that. And then, in the midst of all of this, the Pilgrims show up.
Dun, dun, dun.
Now, let's talk about who these Pilgrims were, specifically. So no one referred to them by this name, obviously. That wasn't
Pilgrim
until
just
much
means
later.
a traveler, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah. We talked about last week the
I know,
Crusades.
exactly.
They were considered pilgrims, but just pilgrims who also killed people on the side.
On the side.
On the side, it's just a side job. So these were specifically Puritan separatists, so people who started their own church, weren't big on the whole Church of England thing. And in the 1600s, they actually left to go to Holland, modern-day Netherlands, to get more legroom, basically to do what they wanted, to, have their own churches and not really have to answer or pay taxes to the Church of England or anything like that. However, during their 12-year stay in the Holland from 1608 to 1620, many of them began to become concerned as they saw their kids were losing their English identity, and many of them were becoming too Dutch.
Too Dutch.
I mean, they didn't like it, they're waving around all these Dutch flowers, wearing Dutch clothing. I mean,
How dare they?
how dare they? How dare they wear those wooden shoes?
Oh.
Windmills.
I forgot. They're the ones with the windmills.
Yeah. Aren't they the ones with cheese as well?
Oh, probably.
Yeah. I know
I feel like.
Dutch people are the tallest people in the world.
Really?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, I'll have to look
I think
it up.
it's like Denmark is number 5 and Netherlands is number 1.
Woohoo.
Like the average height of a man there is like taller than me.
Wow. That's crazy.
They're tall. Like they're windmills.
They're as tall as their windmills.
Yep. Windmills.
And that's where Don Quixote got his giant idea.
Exactly.
Because they're just the same size.
Yep. Makes perfect sense. So, the separatists decided they were going to contact old King James I, and they asked for a patent to build a colony in America. And this kind of goes back to our previous point that the persecution wasn't that bad, because James I was happy, give them a patent to do what they wanted. And they wanted a new home where they could enforce their own ideology and create their own ideal society. A society that they legitimately believed would be like almost a New Jerusalem. So, their plan was they were going to fund their operation, and then they were going to make a profit by catching fish in the New World to pay off their investors. So in late fall 1620, they commissioned the Mayflower, which consisted of 102 passengers. Interestingly enough, only less than half of them were actually pilgrims. Only 49 were...
Wait, what?
Yes.
I've studied this for years. Half? Less than half.
Yes.
And yet they're the ones that we base our entire Thanksgiving stories around.
Yes. That is, yeah. It's
My mind is blown right now.
It's bizarre because that's even enforced in the Charlie Brown movie. Have you ever seen that one?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So only 49 of them were defined as saints, and that meant they were part of the separatist congregation. 53 of them were strangers, what that meant was they weren't sure if you were part of the elect or not.
Oh, my.
Because in the Calvinist mindset, you had people who are elect, people who are saved, strangers, people who are not sure about, and the reprobate, people who are damned. They didn't invite anyone who was reprobate in their mind.
But they let people that they weren't sure about come with them.
Yes.
Well, could they have, okay, I'm trying to think of how to word this. Could they pick and choose who could go with them?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, some of them were like people who were involved in the business.
Okay.
And others were just like, crew members they needed for them to help. Now, they meant by strangers is that they believed at the time
Wait, hold on. I'm trying to think. So the 53, that included crew members, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that makes a little bit more sense with the numbers. So it may have been of the passengers more than half.
Yeah.
But probably not that much more.
Yeah. But all of them pretty much went to stay.
Right.
For the most. And what they meant by strangers was that they would believe eventually in your life it would be revealed whether you were part of the elect or not.
But for right now, they were
right
just
now you
people.
don't know. So they set sail on September 6th, and they reached Cape Cod, Massachusetts, by November 11th. However, funny story, the settlers actually didn't know how to fish.
Why did they go?
They were like, we're going to make money by fishing.
We don't know how to fish.
We don't know how to fish. So what
Didn't they live in towns?
Yeah.
The entire time they were alive?
Yeah.
Why did they think that fishing was a good idea?
I guess they're like, we'll just catch some fish. There's lots of cool fish. And,
We'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. So what they ended up doing in Cape Cod is they resorted to stealing from Native American graves and abandoned buildings to feed themselves.
That's awkward.
And this led to a small fight with some of the natives, but no one was killed in this fight. Now, on December 12th, they landed officially in Plymouth. They did not, however, land on any specific rock. So, the Plymouth Rock stuff is folklore, unfortunately.
Aww.
I'm sorry to ruin everyone's Thanksgiving dreams.
That's so sad.
Now, in the early...
So sad.
It is. It really is.
Well, isn't there a rock there, but it's like nowhere near the shore
No,
that
it's
they have
nowhere.
named Plymouth Rock?
Yes. Yeah, it's nowhere near there, fortunately. Now, in the early months, due to a lack of shelter, scurvy, and a lot of people still living on the Mayflower, 44 of those settlers would die.
So almost half.
Almost half.
That's so sad.
Yeah, they just were not prepared at all. Now, in March of 1621, after that bad winter ended, the Pilgrims were visited by a guy named Samoset, and he was a sachem of the Abenaki tribe. And interestingly enough, he spoke to them in English, because he had learned it from some English fishermen in the region that he had, talked to, who had come to visit him at times. And he told them they had raised their town in a place which used to be a native land, but everyone had died during the Great Dying, and it belonged to the Wampanoag and their chief, Massaoit. And a few days later, Samoset came back with 5 of his buddies, including a guy named Tisquantum, the guy known as Squanto, who almost everyone knows about.
Yes.
Now, Massaoit really didn't trust the English for good reason, and he asked for a hostage, which he got from Edward Winslow. And afterwards, Massaoit met with the governor, John Carver, and signed a treaty of peace with the settlers. After that got established, Squanto would, and this is true, he would teach the English settlers how to plant, various seeds. Like he said, plant the seeds of maize, beans, and squash together. They're the sister crops. Put them together and you'll get better crops.
Oh, yeah. I've heard that if you plant certain plants together, they take care of each other.
Yes.
Whereas other plants, if you plant them together, they will destroy each other.
Yeah, that's why I call them, they're the sister plants. Mm-hmm. And Squanto, what's interesting is his true story was a bit wild because he had been kidnapped 7 years earlier by a group led by John Smith. Yes, that John Smith from Pocahontas, that one.
The one that was...
Jamestown.
Blonde. He was the blonde one, right?
Yes. In real life, he was brown hair.
Oh, who was the guy who played him?
Mel Gibson?
I think so.
Yeah, it was Mel Gibson.
Mel Gibson. And then, wasn't Christian Bale the redhead?
Yeah, Christian Bale was his redheaded
Those
little
are
boy.
the only other people I remember.
Yep. So he was then sold by a slave to the Spanish, and eventually he made his way to England, where he learned English. He returned home in 1619, where he saw the effects of the disease on his people, and Massaoit took him in. Massasoit took him in as an interpreter. So he helped the Pilgrims get established, and by the fall in October, the Pilgrims had a big harvest. They were finally doing well for themselves.
Good.
And so they planned a big feast. And Massaoit, showed up with 91 warriors and 5 deers for the meal.
I'm glad they contributed.
Yes, they contributed. Everyone contributed.
Of course they were going to contribute.
Because if you show...
5 deers, that's a lot.
Yeah. And for 3 days, they ate and entertained each other. And the type of foods they ate would have been stuff like turkey, onions, bean, lettuce, cabbage, spinach, carrots, and corn. Now, corn actually wouldn't have been served on the cob. They probably would have turned into cornmeal and then boiled or pounded into a mush or a porridge. And seafood would have been on the menu as well. Because, they live by the sea. There's lots of fish. They would have...
That they finally learned how to catch.
They finally learned how to catch some fish. Now, they probably would have had some pumpkins, although there wouldn't have been any pumpkin pie, obviously.
So sad.
No, so sad.
So there's nothing really that, from based on this, except for, the corn.
And the turkey.
And the turkey that we'd use today.
Yeah, we'd use the vegetables.
Yeah, the vegetables, but...
And seafood isn't really...
Beans. That's a random one.
Seafood isn't a popular, Thanksgiving thing.
Yeah, I'm sure in some places it is.
Yeah, I'm sure in some places, yeah. But what's interesting about this is that even though this was the first quote-unquote Thanksgiving, the Puritans would not have used the word Thanksgiving to describe it, because a day of Thanksgiving for them was a day of, prayer and fasting, where you give thanks. It was sort of a somber occasion.
So the opposite.
Yes, this was more just, hey, let's get together and, celebrate our harvest. It's like harvest homecoming.
Right.
So,
I wouldn't say they deserved it, because, never mind, that was going into Dave Ramsey mode. I'm sorry. I don't even agree with Dave Ramsey. Why
deserved it? What do you mean
I was
by
just saying
deserved?
that they deserved to celebrate. They did. They did deserve to celebrate.
Yeah, a lot of you end up dying. Like, come on.
I don't know why I went into Dave Ramsey mode.
Why?
I'm
They
so
should
sorry.
have. They should have just
Better
eaten
than I
rice.
deserve.
Better. Should have just eaten rice and beans, beans and rice. Beans and rice, rice and beans.
Although judge them for that, I wouldn't. I would hope not.
Here's
After
the thing,
a bad
though.
year.
A lot of what Puritan ideology was, like a lot of the thrift and stuff, that is directly inspiring Dave Ramsey.
So he is puritanical.
Yes, and
More
that's a
than-
lot. That's a lot of Calvinistic ideology from Europe as well.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, just the whole, pull yourself up, work really hard, be
And
thrifty.
you see where that got them.
Yeah.
Half of them were dead. They had to depend on other people.
Yes, they did. Now, here's some interesting stuff, because we have to talk about what happened after all that. Now, Squanto was actually up to some goonery after this celebration, and he became convinced that with his big position, he could actually overthrow the chief Massasoit.
Oops.
And he tried to persuade the locals to try to kill Massasoit and take up English trade and get English firearms so they could defeat their Narragansett allies. So Massasoit learned of this plot, and he demanded the English turn over Squanto. William Bradford actually refused because he thought Squanto was too valuable. But after some discussion, he was about to hand Squanto over, but then the Pilgrims caught sight of another ship coming nearby. So the Massasoit's men got spooked, they left, and Squanto was left alive, although he would pass away later that year. And these group of settlers were a new group of English, and they began harassing the native Massachusetts. The Massachusetts.
There's a lot going on.
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. I could never say Massachusetts right.
Yeah. Well, it comes from the name from that tribe, the Massachusetts.
I know, but I've never been able to say it right.
Neither have I. So, this group of settlers actually began harassing the Massachusetts. And after that, the Massachusetts decided to fight these settlers, and the Pilgrims actually ended up intervening and attacking this Massachusetts tribe. So after only a year, there's some fighting going on. So there is one sort of bright spot, though, and that is the treaty that William Bradford signed with the Wampanoag guy, Massasoit. That actually did last from 1621 to 1660. So
most of their lifetime.
Yeah, so about 39 years. It lasted through Massasoit's life and his son when he took over.
Okay.
But as other Puritan groups arrived in Massachusetts, because not just separatists would settle there, the big one actually was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was mostly just not separatists, but just other Puritans. As we settled this area in the New England area, they didn't really care too much about, these treaties, and soon, war would break out with other groups. The first war was the Pequot War, and that's when the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth, and another colony named Saybrook would attack the Pequot tribe in southern New England. And there's a variety of reasons for this, but the most infamous incident is when they would massacre the populace at Mystic in 1637. This was a pretty horrendous attack, and the Puritans at the time would justify it by claiming that, well, in the Old Testament, sometimes there was a command given to kill heathens, so we're just doing that. And in 1675, there was another conflict that broke out called King Philip's War, and this was the Wampanoag. There was a new chief named Metacomet, and he got sick of all these encroachments by all these English, and he tried to get together a coalition of Native American tribes, and they tried to drive the settlers out. And they were almost successful, but they didn't really have a whole lot of well-defined goals, and because there was just so many more settlers than them, eventually they were defeated. Now, the reason why conflicts broke out between the Puritans and Native Americans is just, to put it bluntly, they viewed them as being, quote-unquote, savages who needed to be driven out. And in
Savages.
like Pocahontas.
Yes.
And they generally thought if they're not going to adopt our brand of Christianity and Christian practices, then they're obviously not part of the elect. So if we let them stay, they're going to damage the purity of our societies.
Dun, dun, dun.
And there also were some misunderstandings that would break out between them. Like the way they would do war was different. Like the natives would commonly like capture a few people and bring them back, and sometimes they would, torture them. But in the native idea, if you're being like beaten up, you're supposed to respond to that stoically. And one thing they noticed is that they would see like a lot of these pilgrims, people were so afraid of death, and they're like, well, you tell us all about this heaven stuff and, all your religions. Why are you so afraid of death? So there was a lot of misunderstandings, and also just because of, some good old-fashioned early racism, lots of problems. So all this considered, what's really the legacy of Thanksgiving? Because it's kind of weird to talk about Thanksgiving as a holiday, because you have all this background of all the bad stuff that happened between excuse me, the colonization of America, and also the way Thanksgiving became an official holiday in America is also a little weird. Like, generally speaking, some presidents might declare a day of Thanksgiving, much like, it was a day of fasting or prayer. But in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was actually the first to officially call for this day of Thanksgiving in November 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War.
It makes sense. They needed something.
They needed something to do.
Something for morale.
And after that, every president after him would make it a tradition to declare the final Thursday in November to be Thanksgiving. So it wasn't official. The president at the time would just say, this day is Thanksgiving. But in 1939, there were actually 5 Thursdays in November that year. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt came up with an idea. He said, okay, Thanksgiving is always going to be the 4th Thursday of November. And he said he wanted to do it so they would give more time for businesses to advertise their Christmas sales.
I wonder why it's not a specific day.
Yeah, it was just because it's whatever the 4th Thursday is.
I don't know why. Maybe it's so you can have an extra day and then the weekend?
Yeah, probably. Now, his justification was, at the time, obviously, and even today, businesses weren't allowed to advertise their Christmas sales before, after Thanksgiving. So his idea was the Great Depression, so let's give them
Today? Did you just say today they're not allowed to?
No, back then.
Okay, I was
back
like,
then,
wait
sorry.
a second, hold on.
If I said that, I...
Well, I don't know if you did or not.
If I said that, I misspoke.
It's like, they're definitely, I'm already getting Christmas stuff.
Yeah. So his idea was, give them a little bit extra advertising time, because it's a Great Depression.
Right.
However, getting back around to the big question, does Thanksgiving give a good message? On the one hand, you do have an event where natives and settlers got along, and peace did last for a little bit. But the new settlers obviously didn't respect this peace, and even the Plymouth colony quickly got involved in some bad stuff. One could argue this is the beginning of a very sad legacy of friendship being turned aside for violence and racism.
Oh, no.
One could argue that. But, on the other hand, we can look at this holiday as a good time to appreciate what we have and what we could have had if we just continued in this process of really just, being grateful for each other and working together. And instead of, resulting towards violence and misunderstanding, of trying to work towards something better. And we can also look at a time as we welcome others that we wouldn't normally engage with. And I can think of a very modern story. You've heard of that story of the grandma who sent out the text message to the wrong number?
Yes, that was so sweet. And last I looked, they're still celebrating Thanksgiving.
Yeah. Wasn't it he responded and said, hey, I'm not your son?
Yeah, he's like, I'm not your grandson. And then they sent pictures to each other. And she's like, oh, okay. And then he's like, well, is dinner still on? She's like, yep, you can come on over.
Yeah.
And he did. And they've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think, Thanksgiving can be a time, just celebrate among your immediate family. But, it might be a good time to also invite some people that you wouldn't normally think of. Because, if you view it as a time to really appreciate what you have and also reach out to other people, much like during Christmas time, it can be a very good thing.
Yeah.
I think it depends on how you look at it, because Thanksgiving, I wouldn't say, isn't as obviously problematic as like Christopher Columbus Day or something like that.
Yeah.
It's more of almost like it's almost like a bright light in a sea of a lot of bad stuff. As long as we keep in mind the actual history and not just turn into a legend, as we're kin to do.
So no buckle hats.
No buckle hats. And I'm not sure what the type of headdresses the Wampanoags would have worn, but I can pretty much guarantee it doesn't look like the ones they have the kids wear.
And I'm 95% sure they weren't wearing loincloths in the middle of winter.
No, you really wouldn't have. Who would be wearing loincloths then?
I don't know.
Unless you're just really tough. You're He-Man. He-Man. So yeah, guys, want to wish you all, guys and girls and other people, want to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving, no matter who you celebrate it with, whether it's your crazy relatives or your crazy friends, or your cats, or your dogs, or your hamsters. Hopefully they aren't on the meal.
I was going to say, same with your family.
Yes. Well, I mean, cannibals. We have to invite them to Thanksgiving as well.
On that note, I don't think we're going to be meeting next week.
No, because next week is Thanksgiving, but we will be back the Thursday after, and we'll talk about some cool stuff. And thank you for joining us. Have a great Thanksgiving, and you can follow us on